Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're retired, close to retirement, or helping an older parent keep up with rent, this is one of those updates you really do not want to miss. There are major housing support changes being discussed and rolled out around 2026, and depending on income, age, and where you live, some seniors could see serious rent relief, deeper housing subsidies, or access to programs that make rent feel almost free compared with normal market prices. But I want to start with the most important point right away, so nobody gets confused by headlines. There is not one brand new nationwide law that suddenly gives every retiree free rent. What is happening is a mix of proposed federal changes, existing HUD programs, and updated rules that could make housing help more valuable or more important for seniors in the months ahead. So in this video, I'm going to break down what's real, what's changing, what may be ending, and what this could mean for your monthly budget. Right now, the main federal housing help for many retirees and seniors still comes through existing HUD-backed programs like Housing Choice Vouchers, also called Section 8, Public Housing, Project-Based Rental Assistance, and Section 202 Supportive Housing for the Elderly. In simple terms, these programs are meant to help low-income households, including elderly people, afford a safe place to live when rent in the private market is too high. With vouchers, a senior can often rent an apartment in the private market, and the local housing agency pays part of the rent directly to the landlord. With Section 202, the housing is specifically aimed at low-income residents aged 62 and older, often with supportive services built in. In many of these programs, the resident typically pays around 30% of adjusted monthly income toward rent, while the subsidy covers the rest up to program limits. That is why some people describe the help as free rent, even though in most cases it is really deeply reduced rent, not literally zero rent for everyone. Now here is where 2026 becomes a big deal. The Trump administration's FY 2026 HUD budget request proposed replacing several existing rental assistance programs, including Housing Choice Vouchers, Public Housing, Project-Based Rental Assistance, Section 202 for the elderly, and Section 811 for people with disabilities, with something called a state rental assistance program. The idea is to move away from multiple federal rental programs and instead send formula-based funding to states, which would then run their own rental assistance systems. According to HUD's budget documents, states would be required to prioritize elderly and disabled households and consider households already receiving assistance. So if you are a senior hearing that housing aid may be changing, this is probably the biggest reason why. It is a real proposal, it could reshape how help is delivered, and it is being discussed as a major restructuring of federal housing support. But there is a very important catch. This is a budget request and policy proposal, not an already enacted universal benefit. That distinction matters a lot, because when people hear new housing aid, they sometimes assume checks are already on the way, or that rent is about to disappear automatically. That is not what the documents say. What they say is that the federal government proposed a new state-based system with language suggesting that elderly and disabled households would be prioritized, while non-elderly, non-disabled households could face tighter rules and even time limits under the proposal. HUD also separately announced a proposed rule giving local housing agencies and project owners more flexibility to use work requirements and time limits for non-elderly, non-disabled adults, while explicitly saying protections for elderly and disabled households would be preserved. So for seniors, the big takeaway is this. Older adults are not the target of the stricter work-focused changes. In fact, the policy direction being discussed points toward protecting or prioritizing seniors compared with other groups. But again, proposals are not the same as guarantees, and the final outcome depends on Congress, rulemaking, state design, and local implementation. So, what may be ending? First, one source of rent relief that did help many households during the pandemic is already over. Treasury says the Emergency Rental Assistance Program's ERA2 period of performance ended on September 30, 2025, and grantees can no longer use those funds to assist renters. That means a lot of people who once depended on emergency back rent or temporary rent help cannot count on that same COVID-era support in 2026. Second, under the FY 2026 HUD budget request, funding for several long-standing federal rental assistance categories would be eliminated and replaced by the new state program if Congress ever enacted that plan. So when you hear that something may be ending, the truth is there are two different stories. One program, Pandemic Emergency Rental Aid, has in fact ended, while several major senior-related housing support categories have only been proposed for replacement, not automatically shut down today. That is why retirees should pay close attention but not panic. Now let's talk about what new benefits or updated advantages seniors may actually see in practice, because this is where the story becomes very real for people on a fixed income. Under HOTMA-related rule changes, the standard deduction for elderly and disabled households increased from $400 to $525, with annual inflation adjustments. That matters because deductions lower the income amount used to calculate rent in housing assistance formulas. Lower countable income can translate into lower tenant rent. At the same time, there is a trade-off. The threshold for deducting medical, attendant care, and certain auxiliary aid expenses rose from 3% of income to 10% of income, which may reduce deductions for some households with moderate medical costs while still helping those with much larger expenses. HUD has also acknowledged delays in implementation for some housing agencies because of system changes, so the rollout may not look identical in every community at the same moment. Still, for many seniors, the important point is that rent calculations are being updated, and these updates can directly affect what comes out of your pocket each month. Here's the easiest way to understand how this kind of housing aid could work if you qualify. You apply through a local public housing agency or a senior housing provider. The agency checks your income, household size, citizenship or eligible immigration status, social security documentation, and sometimes asset information. If you qualify and a spot is available, you may receive a voucher or be offered a place in subsidized housing. Then your rent is generally tied to your income instead of the full market rent. So instead of facing a rent bill based on what the neighborhood costs, your payment is linked to what you can realistically afford. In the voucher program, HUD says your family rent portion is usually 30% of your adjusted monthly income, although it can be higher in some situations, especially if you choose a more expensive unit. There is often also a minimum rent, commonly around $25 to $50, though hardship exemptions may be available. That is why someone may feel like they are getting almost free rent support, even when technically they are still paying a small share. When it comes to eligibility, income is the big one, and this is where people often get overwhelmed. The good news is, you do not need to memorize complicated formulas. Think of it like this: the lower your income relative to your area, the stronger your chances usually are. HUD says eligibility for vouchers is based on local income limits, and generally families must be extremely low income or very low income. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition's guide, 75% of new and turnover voucher households must have extremely low income, usually below 30% of area median income or the federal poverty line, whichever is higher, while the remaining share can include households with income up to 80% of area median income. That means the exact number is not the same in Miami, Phoenix, rural Alabama, or Los Angeles. A retiree living on Social Security alone might qualify in many places, while a retired couple with a pension and investment income might qualify in one city, but not another. The simplest rule is this: your local area matters just as much as your age. Age also matters depending on the program. For regular housing choice vouchers, seniors are one of the groups the program is designed to help, but the program is not age-restricted. For Section 202 supportive housing, the target group is low-income residents age 62 or older. That makes Section 202 especially important for older adults who want housing built with senior needs in mind, sometimes including accessibility features or services that make day-to-day life easier. On the asset side, HOTMA also brought in rules saying households generally should not own real property suitable as a residence or have assets above a threshold of $100,000 adjusted for inflation, while retirement savings accounts are excluded and some households may self-certify assets below a lower threshold. The fine print can vary, and local agencies still matter a lot, but the practical meaning is simple: being elderly alone is not enough. The aid is mainly aimed at seniors with modest income and limited accessible housing options. If you are already receiving housing help right now, what does all of this mean for you? In most cases, it does not mean your current support vanishes overnight. If you already have a voucher, live in public housing, or live in a subsidized senior property, the key thing is to stay alert for recertification notices agency letters, and any local policy changes. The 2026 conversation is more about how the system could be reorganized and how future rules might be structured than about an immediate nationwide cancellation of current senior benefits. In fact, the available federal documents repeatedly indicate that elderly and disabled households are supposed to be protected or prioritized compared with non-elderly, non-disabled adults in the newer proposals. So, if you are an older renter already receiving help, the smarter move is not to assume disaster or victory. The smart move is to keep your paperwork current, report income changes correctly, respond to your housing authority quickly, and watch for any notices about how your local agency is applying updated rules. If you are a senior with low income who is not yet receiving housing aid, this story may matter even more, because the biggest challenge for many older adults is not keeping a subsidy, it is getting into the system in the first place. HUD makes clear that waiting lists can be long, and it may be necessary to apply to multiple housing authorities. Some agencies give selection preferences that can move certain applicants up the list faster, and elderly status can matter depending on local rules. So imagine a 73-year-old widow living on $1,350 a month in Social Security, paying $1,050 in rent for a one-bedroom apartment. She is left trying to cover food, prescriptions, utilities, transportation, and phone bills with just a few $100s. If she gets into a voucher or senior housing program and her tenant share drops closer to 30% of adjusted income, her monthly housing cost could fall dramatically. That difference could be the line between constantly choosing which bill to skip and finally having breathing room. If you are planning to retire soon, the message is a little different. You may not feel low income today because you are still working, but retirement can change the math quickly. A person earning $52,000 a year today may not qualify for assistance, but once they retire and their income drops to Social Security plus a small pension, their eligibility picture could change completely. That is why it is so important for near retirees to stop thinking about housing help as something only for other people. If your rent is rising faster than your retirement income, you need to understand these programs before the crisis hits, not after. Start by checking local HUD income limits, learning which waiting lists are open, and asking whether your area has senior designated housing, voucher preferences, or project-based senior apartments. Waiting until the lease renewal notice lands on the table is often too late, especially in tight rental markets. Let's make the money side even more real with a few simple examples. Suppose a retiree named Linda receives $1,500 a month between Social Security and a tiny pension. 30% of that is about $450. If the apartment she qualifies for rents at $1,250 and the local subsidy structure supports that unit, the assistance could cover roughly the remaining $800, sometimes more or less depending on utility allowances and local payment standards. Now imagine Robert, a 68-year-old renter paying $1,100 out of a $1,700 monthly income. That means almost 65% of his income is going to rent before groceries or medicine. If he gets into a subsidized housing arrangement and his required share is brought closer to income-based rent, he could free up hundreds of dollars each month. And for a very low-income senior with hardship status, even the minimum rent could be reduced or temporarily suspended in some cases. This is why so many retirees search phrases like free rent support, because from a practical standpoint, the savings can feel life-changing. Those monthly savings do not just help with rent, they ripple through everything else in a senior household budget. A lower rent burden can mean staying current on electricity in the summer and heat in the winter. It can mean filling prescriptions on time instead of stretching them. It can mean buying groceries without relying on a credit card or keeping a reliable car on the road for doctor visits. For seniors on fixed income, the danger is usually not one giant financial emergency. It is the constant squeeze of too many medium-sized bills arriving every month with no room to recover. Housing aid changes that by lowering the biggest recurring expense. When the rent burden comes down, the whole budget becomes less fragile. And when a budget becomes less fragile, the senior is less likely to fall behind, face eviction, move in with relatives unexpectedly, or go without basic care. So why might the government be pushing these housing support changes in the first place? One reason is obvious. Housing costs have gone up sharply in many parts of the country. while many seniors are living mainly on Social Security, modest pensions, or retirement accounts that do not stretch like they used to. Another reason is pressure on the housing assistance system itself. The federal government and local agencies know demand is high, waiting lists are long, and many eligible households never get help at all. The 2026 proposal also reflects a political push to simplify multiple rental assistance programs into one state-based system and to focus stricter work-related rules on non-elderly, non-disabled adults rather than older or disabled households. Whether you agree with that approach or not, the government's message is clear. The system is under pressure, and policymakers are trying to decide who gets priority, how much flexibility states should have, and how to stretch limited resources further. What could this mean going forward? If the current proposal were ever enacted, one possible outcome is that seniors and disabled households could become an even more clearly protected priority group for rental aid, while younger non-disabled households face tighter limits. Another possible outcome is more variation from state to state, because a state-based rental model could lead to different rules, priorities, and application systems depending on where you live. On the other hand, if Congress does not enact that restructuring, then the existing mix of vouchers, public housing, project-based assistance, and senior housing programs will likely remain the practical path retirees use to get rent help, just with continued rule updates and local adjustments. In either case, the lesson for viewers is the same. Do not wait for a headline to tell you you've either won or lost. Monitor official notices, understand your local options, and act early, because the people who benefit most from housing aid are often the ones who got their names on lists before the emergency became impossible to manage. There is also one more point I want to make because it is easy to overlook. Even though the phrase government housing aid for retirees sounds like it should only apply after you are already struggling, the smartest time to learn the rules is before you hit the wall. If you are helping a parent, an aunt, an uncle, or a spouse who is aging into retirement, this is the moment to gather documents, estimate future retirement income, check whether they might qualify as low income in their area, and find out which local housing agencies or senior properties are open for applications. A lot of seniors miss out not because they are ineligible, but because they assume they won't qualify, misunderstand how the income rules work, or never realize that age 62 plus housing even exists in their community. Information itself can save money if it helps you apply before rent becomes completely unmanageable. So let's recap this in the clearest way possible. First, there is no single new 2026 federal law that automatically gives every retiree free rent, but there are major housing support changes and proposals that could strongly affect seniors. Second, current help still mainly comes through programs like housing choice vouchers, public housing, project-based rental assistance, and Section 202 senior housing, where many tenants pay around 30% of adjusted income rather than full market rent. Third, the FY 2026 HUD budget request proposed replacing several existing rental aid programs with a new state rental assistance program that would prioritize elderly and disabled households. But that proposal is not the same thing as enacted law. Fourth, COVID-era emergency rental assistance has ended, so that backstop is no longer available the way it once was. And fifth, recent HOTMA-related updates, including the higher elderly and disabled household deduction, could affect how rent is calculated for some seniors. For retirees already receiving benefits, the message is, stay informed and keep your paperwork current. For low-income seniors not yet receiving help, the message is, apply early, check multiple waiting lists, and do not assume you are disqualified just because you have a small pension or Social Security. And for people planning to retire soon, now is the time to understand how lower retirement income could change your eligibility and your housing strategy. If rent is eating too much of your monthly income, if this update helped make sense of what's happening, make sure you like the video and share it with a parent, grandparent, neighbor, or friend who may be affected by these housing changes. And I really want to hear from you in the comments. Are rents becoming impossible where you live? Have you or a loved one ever applied for Section 8 or senior housing? And do you think seniors should get stronger rent support in 2026 and beyond? Stay tuned because I'll keep bringing you the latest updates on Social Security, housing assistance, and benefit changes in a way that is easy to understand and actually useful.